Coming up, a nuanced look at the Muslim world.
If you know something about the specificities of these communities, some of the hysteria about them is not well placed.
University of Michigan's Juan discusses Arab-Iranian relations, terror tactics in Europe, and Middle Eastern demographics. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
I'm really delighted to welcome Juan. We've been negotiating this for some time, and he is the Richard P. Mitchell Collegiate Professor of History at the University of Michigan. For over 3 decades now, he has been one of the most sensible and dedicated voices in trying to put the relationship of the West and the Muslim world in some kind of a historical context that's so essential to understanding so much of what is going on in the extended region today. His most recent book is The New Arabs: How the Millennial Generation is Changing the Middle East. He's written widely about Egypt, Iran, Iraq, and South Asia, and has written especially about the upheavals in the Arab world since 2011. He has a command of Arabic, Persian, and Urdu, and reads Turkish, and has lived in various parts of the Muslim world for nearly 10 years and continues to travel widely there. You wrote recently a thought-provoking title article, Can the Arab World Live with the Iran Nuclear Deal? So I throw the question back to you in welcoming you. Can the Arab world live with the Iran nuclear deal?
Well, I think the answer is that some parts of it can live with that deal very handily. Others have some problems with it. I think when we think of the Arab world in the United States, we tend to think of the Gulf Cooperation Council states, the Gulf oil monarchies, who are often neighbors of Iran or just across the Gulf from them, and who have been more cautious, sometimes vocal, in being critical of Iran's nuclear enrichment program. But if you take the 22 states of the Arab League, it becomes clear that the Arab world is quite divided on these issues. First of all, we don't think of it this way, but there are several countries in the Arab world that are allied with Iran. And this is true of Iraq, of Syria, of Lebanon, all of whom expressed delight at the program. And I figure you're talking about on the order of 60 million people in the Arab world right there. And then the independent nationalist Arab states, ones who are not close to Saudi Arabia. Sometimes they have a leftist Arab nationalist background. Algeria, for example, was optimistic, as was Tunisia, the only of the Arab Spring states that's had a relatively successful democratic transition. If one means, can Saudi Arabia live with this deal? That's a very different question than the Arab world in general. And so I think the attitudes are quite diverse. Even within the Gulf Cooperation Council, one of the major members of the 6 is Oman, which has played a role in mediating between the United States and Iran, and which expressed itself very positively about this deal. So Saudi Arabia, Qatar, some others sort of issued communiques saying that they welcomed that there was this framework and they're hopeful where it would go and so forth. They're obviously hedging their bets. But in the region in general, I think what Tunisia said was that any framework that allows for peace rather than war would be a great good thing for the Middle East.
Iran, of course, is the major Shia Muslim state in the extended region. And again, in terms of imperfect awareness of what exactly is going on, when one looks at what's happening in Yemen and with ISIS and so on, there's this sense that we're in some sort of existential struggle between Shia and Sunni Islam. Iran's Revolutionary Guard on the one hand, and the Gulf Cooperation Council, the Sunni coalition on the other. I think you have a somewhat more nuanced and qualified view of that as a defining theory.
Yeah, well, I agree that, from 30,000 feet, it looks as though Iran has put together a block of countries with significant Shiite populations and is using the Shiite form of Islam as a kind of soft power wedge to establish a kind of bloc. But if you go down on the ground, then that way of looking at it becomes difficult to maintain because, well, Syria, for example, where Iran is supporting the government of Bashar al-Assad, is a Ba'athist state, which is irreligious. I mean, they actually persecuted religion. It's true that the upper echelons of the Ba'ath Party in Syria are staffed by members of the Alawite minority who are technically, we scholars would consider them a form of Shiite Islam. But Alawite Islam is barely Islam. They don't have mosques. They don't pray 5 times a day. They have Neoplatonic and Gnostic philosophies coming from the pre-Islamic Greek world. There's a kind of mythology there that's very important in their thinking. And I went to Antakya one time, which is an Alawite city, and I asked someone, I was eager to meet an Alawite. I asked someone local, "Are you an Alawite?" And he said, "No, praise be to God, I'm a Muslim." So the idea that Iran is supporting Syria because Orthodox 12-er Shiite Islam, feels any kind of kinship with the Alawites is crazy. I mean, the Ayatollahs would issue fatwas of, excommunication and heresy and so forth against Alawites.
Let's move to Europe, if we may. Just a couple of questions there. On Europe, and specifically in France, you use a very interesting term, a phenomenon you called sharpening the contradictions, and saying that attacks such as Charlie Hebdo, they're actually contrived by Al-Qaeda to create a backlash that will bring politically unengaged Muslims into the fold. Explain that a little bit.
Yes. Well, I see evidence of Al-Qaeda thinkers like Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was the number 2 man for a long time before bin Laden was killed, in Al-Qaeda, being influenced by Marxist thought and radical Marxism. And this is very clear in the technical terms that the Muslim far right uses. They talk about a vanguard, and this is a Leninist term. In some radical forms of Marxism, activists were impatient with the working class, which seemed not to want to fulfill its historical duty by rising up against the business classes, and engaged in sabotage. Not everywhere all the time, but there were some groups that did that kind of thing in hopes of provoking a class war, because they knew the business classes would call upon their agents, the police, to crack down hard on sabotage and workers' activism and so forth. And I think that Al-Qaeda picked up this kind of thinking from the Marxist fringe in places like Egypt and so forth. And I think that it's a deliberate strategy on their part, the sharpening of contradictions, or the heightening of contradictions, it's called. And I think it explains everything that happened in Iraq. That is to say, I remember reading a New York Times piece, sort of 2005 or so, that Al-Qaeda in Iraq had blown up a pet shop. And there were pieces of rabbits and snakes kind of wiggling on the ground. And this author in the New York Times expressed himself with amazement. He said, "We should get out of Iraq now, because we can't understand why would you do that. And if you don't understand what your enemy is doing, then you should not be there." And I understood exactly what they were doing. They were hitting soft targets. They were hitting businesses, and it was a Shiite pet shop. It was a Shiite-owned pet shop. And what they were trying to do was to get the Shiites goat in Iraq. They were trying to provoke a civil war because they hoped that the Shiite clans who were being hit would go and attack Sunnis. And if they went and attacked the Sunnis, then Al-Qaeda could go to the Sunnis and say, "Well, gee, you seem to be being attacked. We could protect you." So by provoking attacks on their own community, they actually could parlay that into power. And at the time, I was skeptical that they could succeed in this, but you come to last June, and they took over Mosul the second largest city in the country, in exactly this way, by continually provoking the Shia, getting reprisals going, and then going to the Sunnis against whom the reprisals were waged and saying, you need protection. And by that time, the Mosulis said, yes, we do. And would you please come in? Even though Mosulis are cosmopolitan, secular-minded people, but they were willing to bring in this radical fundamentalist group just because they were tired of being targeted by the Shiite government.
Of course, in France, it's a very interesting situation. Most Muslims in France and other parts of Europe were born in Europe. They're not immigrants. So this, I guess, also speaks to some of the tension of trying to create a religious wedge, as it were, to create something essentially artificial.
Well, the interesting thing about the French Muslims is how French they are. So we think there are about 5 million of them just from the immigration statistics. And there was a French ministry conducted research. It's hard to research religion in France because of the separation of religion and state and so forth, but they got permission to do this. And they did a large-scale poll of people they thought were French Muslims. And there are 5 million, we think, just by ethnicity and immigration, but only 2 million, what would be projected to be 2 million once you did the numbers, said they were interested in religion at all. So the majority of French Muslims are laïc, they're secular, and not particularly, they don't see religion as a primary marker of identity. In fact, in the United States, when they do these large-scale polling about your religious beliefs, back in the 90s, only 8% of Americans said they had no religion. Now it's gone up to 15%. A lot of the millennials are less religious. But the French Muslims, people of Muslim heritage in France, are tremendously more secular than the ordinary American. So this is a problem for radical groups like Al-Qaeda that want people to not only be religious, but to be extremely religious, to have religion as the organizing principle of their lives and to be willing to use violence to make it so, that so many French Muslims, they're into rap and rye and various forms of urban culture, and some of them, are poets and writers and in French and participate in French culture in very serious ways. So they don't want that. And if they could just get the French right to be more powerful and more vicious, they might be able to herd the French Muslims into the arms of Al-Qaeda. This is what I believe they're about.
Sharpening the contradiction.
Yes.
Yeah. Last question before we go to the audience, and it deals with ISIS or Daesh. There's obviously a reflexive and understandable horror at the atrocities that are carried out and filmed for the world to see. But there's also the fear that volunteers who go for ISIS to Syria and Iraq and so on and so forth from Western democracies come back hardened and seasoned in terror tactics that they will then employ on the host country, their country of origin. I believe you see this too as exaggerated.
Well, I think it's greatly exaggerated. First of all, I remember British Prime Minister Cameron gave a speech in which he said 400 young men had gone from the UK to fight with Daesh or ISIL in Syria. And what I thought to myself when he said that with some alarm was, well, gee, that's not very many. 400? You can get 400 people to do anything. The Muslim British community has almost doubled in the last 15 years through immigration and natural increase. There are 3.7 million Muslims in the UK now, almost 4 million. So 400 would be a vanishingly small number. And then if you look into their biographies, many of them are teenagers. This is a form of juvenile delinquency for many of them. And some of them have come back quite disillusioned. They said they were made to do kitchen police duty and wash dishes, and that wasn't what they went there for. They were horrified at the brutality and so forth. So, I lived in the early years of the civil war in Lebanon, and at that time, militias were rampant and a lot of killing was going on, and people were saying, well, what would the next generation be like? Won't they be so brutalized by all this and getting used to violence? And actually, the Lebanese have been quite good about getting through this very fragile political period without picking up guns again, because I think the elders said, no, we did that, and it doesn't go anywhere good. So I think the opposite can also happen, which is that people can be repulsed by this kind of violence.
Do you see a threat to Europe, where is almost majority? There was a book about French president who is a Muslim. It's fiction, but how fiction is it 20 years from now?
No, there's no prospect of Muslims becoming majority in Europe. In fact, demographically speaking, it's very unlikely. It's possible for them to become 5% of the population, 10% of the population. But there are limitations. Even the recent economic crisis after 2008 has cut down on pull factors in immigration. The European Muslim population is largely ethnically Muslim, and it's very diverse, and each country is diverse with regards to the origins of its community. So in Germany, there's roughly 4 million Muslims. It's a country of 82 million. And of the 4 million, 3 million are Turks, or ethnically Turkish. But about half of those are from the Alevi minority in Turkey, which again, broadly speaking, is classed as Shiite, but it's a kind of folk Shiism that doesn't have ayatollahs or anything like that. And in the Cold War period, many Alevis in Turkey became Marxists and adopted a very secular point of view. So they are disproportionately, very disproportionately present among the so-called Muslims of Germany. And I can't tell you how unlikely an Alevi leftist is to be at all attracted by ISIL, which is I think has departed from the Sunni tradition but comes out of it. If you know something about the specificities of these communities, some of the hysteria about them is not well placed. And so I think the big problem for Muslims in Europe is economic. And in France, for instance, a lot of the Algerians and Moroccans and others who came and settled in urban areas and were trying to get factory labor have been left high and dry. In France, they put the slums on the outside of the city rather than in the inside the way we do. The difficulty here is that very often you have large youth populations among Muslim third-generation immigrants now, or fourth generation, who are not near jobs. And there's no particular prospect of them being near a job where they live. Nobody's rushing to put factories into the 23rd arrondissement. And actually, there are some French government officials who have suggested maybe that's exactly what should be done, that France has a fairly strong central government that could maybe address some of these problems. And I would just like to say that it's exactly the same, that the Muslims of France, generally speaking, are facing some of the problems that the African American community in Detroit, and I'm from the Detroit area, are facing, and that there's a mismatch between skill sets and where the jobs are, populations and where the jobs are, what kind of jobs are available, and so forth. And as the Detroit auto industry has increasingly roboticized or moved elsewhere or whatever, a lot of people have been left without good paying jobs, and there's a kind of downward spiral, whereas when there are fewer good jobs there, people are forced into the lower middle class and then into slums. Then who wants exactly to invest in a slum? So the business community isn't attracted to that. And we've had all kinds of schemes, enterprise zones and all these kinds of things to try to fix it. But I think the French are in this same kind of situation. So I wouldn't really look at the situation of the Muslims of France and the first thing come to my mind, religion. The question is, how could you employ these youth? A lot of them are literate and have skills that could be employed.
You've written extensively on millennials in the Arab world. And one theme that comes up very commonly in coverage on millennials is the idea of it being a demographic time bomb in the MENA region. And I'm curious what your take is on that framing, and also what your take is on the steps that would be necessary for this demographic time bomb to be less of a time bomb and more of an asset for the region.
Something like nearly a third of the Arab world is millennials, people born in roughly the 80s and 90s and very early zeros. So the time bomb has already gone off. And some of what we're seeing in the region, is at least implicated in this phenomenon. So in Syria, like 180,000 youth were coming online every year that needed a job, and the Syrian Ba'ath Party was not, notably good at providing them with jobs. And so some of the protests that you saw in 2011 by youth against the Ba'ath regime were job protests, and very explicitly so. And then when the regime pulled up tanks and started firing at them, these were peaceful demonstrations they were firing at, the youth picked up guns and it went to civil war. But a lot of the discontent was over jobs. And then there's an ecological crisis in some of the region as well. There's been a drought in that part of the world since the late 90s, which has gotten worse since 2004, and which is very long-lived. It's still there. And it's made it very hard for farmers to make a living. A lot of farmers have lost their farms because of lack of water resources. There are cyclical droughts in the Middle East. It's an arid zone. It can't be proven to have been caused by climate change. But one thing we do know is that the effects of drought in agriculture are exacerbated by high temperatures. So we know that the world is a degree centigrade hotter now than it was 100 years ago. So it's certainly the case that the drought is being exacerbated by climate change. And so a lot of the young farmers from that millennial generation could no longer make it. We're forced to go to cities to look for day work, for construction work and so forth. And especially with the downturn worldwide from 2008 forward, there were no, a lot of big buildings being built in Damascus and Homs and Hama. So there wasn't a lot of work around. So the demographic crisis is partially, it wouldn't be a crisis if you had growing economies. If the economy is growing 3 or 4% a year and population is as well, then that's not a great situation because per capita increase is not going on, but at least it's not going backwards. But in some of these countries, it's going backwards. I mean, there are more people wanting jobs than can be provided. In many of the countries of the region, however, it should be underlined that there has already been a demographic transition. Tunisia had its in the 70s, and it's the most successful of the revolutions. Iran and Turkey both have had their demographic transitions. Now there's a pig in the python belly. The populations of these countries will go on growing for a couple decades. But by mid-century, they're all going to level off. There are some exceptions. Egypt, we thought, underwent its demographic transition around 2007, but the uncertainties of the last few years are such that the Egyptians are back to having kids, and kids are a kind of social security in a place like Egypt. So it's actually growing again, which is not desirable, I think, but or at least is not desirable if they can't get their economy together.
A couple months back, the Obama administration absorbed a lot of criticism for using the term countering violent extremism as opposed to Islam, anything related to Islamism or terrorism. What are your thoughts on this? Is Obama being excessively PC?
No, I think the Americans just are not necessarily very good at diction. Especially some of our cable news networks. But we have a center at Michigan for the Center for Judaic Studies. And Judaic, as an adjective, refers to things having to do with the Jewish religion and people, especially religion, I think. And then we have Islamic studies, which has to do with Islam. But both Judaic and Islamic connotationally have to do with positive things. You talk about Judaic aesthetics, Judaic art, Islamic ethics. There are no Judaic criminals. There are some Jewish criminals, but they're not being Judaic when they're being criminal, right? I mean, they would be breaking the Ten Commandments, which is part of the Judaic part. So in the same way, there are no Islamic criminals. There are Muslim criminals. There are no Islamic criminals. And if you can't have Islamic criminals, then you can't have Islamic terrorists either, because it's against the tradition. I think the demand to talk about Islamic terrorism is itself a form of bigotry. But at the fundament, it's a misunderstanding of how language works in English. And so I think it would be quite wrong to talk about Islamic terrorism, and Mr. Obama is wise to avoid that diction. And I don't think Islam is the only example we can give of where there is a distinction between what adherents do, and there are certainly Muslim terrorists, and what the ideals of the tradition are. And it would be a form of bigotry to imply the tradition itself is encouraging this kind of criminal activity.
I think you've provided much more nuance, both as a historian and as a contemporary observer, and for that, I and our audience thank you very much.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.